So I'd like to introduce you to our speaker for today. Robert Holland is a longtime Chicago resident and an avid and well-known map collector. He's on the board of the Newberry Library. He joined as a trustee in 2015, and now he's the chair starting in 2023. And he's the author of the book Chicago in Maps, 1612 to 2002. So I'm going to turn things over to Robert. Welcome.
Thank you, Roz. A little more by the way of introduction. I am a retired philosophy professor, but I am an avowed cartophile. I love maps. So I was the president of the Chicago Map Society for 7.5 years. We meet at the Newberry Library every third Thursday. If you're interested in joining or getting more information about the Chicago Map Society, go to chicagomapsociety.org and you'll see our website. I've also authored 2 books, as Roz said, Chicago in Maps, and also the Mississippi River in Maps and Views. And I was interested in that because I was born in St. Louis on the Mississippi River. We moved to Wisconsin when I was 5 years old, and then I've been living in Chicago since 1979. Today, I want to present a brief history of the growth of Chicago as told in maps. I hope you'll enjoy. We're going to begin with a beautiful retrospective map that presents a wealth of information about the town of Chicago in its early days. It was produced for the Second World's Fair in 1933, and the map states that it was compiled from data provided by the original map of Chicago about 1833. Now, what map they're referring to is not known. There is no original map of Chicago dated 1833. There is one we'll see in a moment that's dated 1830, but it doesn't really look anything like this. So here are a few highlights on this map. First, in the northwest quadrant of the map, you'll see a wild onion plant depicted with the word Chicago below it. From the language of the local Miami Indians, this word is actually derived from a word used to refer to the wild garlic plant that grew along the banks of the Chicago River. LaSalle was amongst the first to notice that it was also used by the Miami Indians to refer to this little peninsula at the mouth of the Chicago River. Next, we see that at the time of its incorporation as a town, the village of Chicago was centered on what is called the Forks, which was the name the early settlers gave to the confluence of both branches of the Chicago River. The village in its early days was a racially diverse settlement of Native Americans, half-breeds, French Canadians, and Anglo-Americans, a raucous lot. They lived isolated from civilization, traded in furs, and drank liberally in the taverns along the river. As depicted in the inset, can we see it? Can we get rid of this black bar on top or? Oh, I see. Sorry. Maybe I can exit out. I got it. Okay, there we go. Okay, now we've gone too far. Our machine is slow today. There we go. Okay, so here's the forks that we were talking about, and here's a depiction of, doesn't want to cooperate. Let's go back. There we go. All right. Here's a depiction of a hotel, the first post office, and 2 taverns along. So as the establishments centered around the Forks included the Saugonish Hotel, which was the first frame house built in Chicago, Chicago's first post office, the Wolf Tavern, which is a reference to the angular prominence of the west bank of the river, west bank of the Forks, and Sam Miller's Public House, which is right up here. Up. Okay. As more settlers arrived, additional houses were built along, and I'm going to see if I can do this without forwarding it. There we go. Okay. Additional houses were built along South Water Street along the river. And you see a depiction of these houses, just a straight row along the west bank of the river, or sorry, the south bank of the river, all the way down to Fort Dearborn. Now, the first Catholic church built in Chicago. Yeah, we went too far again. There we go. First Catholic church built in Chicago was at the corner of South Water Street and Clark Street. It was built in 1833, called St. Mary's Church, by Augustine Taylor. Now, this church is important because Taylor used a new method of construction called balloon framing, which is used today. If you'll see a house, the side walls are built by long 2x4s. This really sped up the ability to construct new buildings. Okay, the first bridge over the Chicago River was on Dearborn Street. It was a drawbridge. It was built in 1834. It was 300 feet long and with an opening of 60 feet. Gallows-like in its appearance. The city council, abutments were so dangerous that in 1839, the city council ordered it destroyed. Fearing that the city council might change its mind, the citizens immediately went out and chopped it down. It was that dangerous. On the north side of the river, there were only a few houses, most of which belonged to the early settlers in the area. So we have DuSable's original cabin, which was occupied by John Kinsey, who arrived in Chicago in 1804. Anton Wilmette, a longtime employee of Kinsey, was living in Chicago when the troops arrived in 1803. Further out Greenway Road, now Clark Street, is the home of Billy Caldwell, the Sauganash, son of an Irish officer and a Potawatomi princess. Now, Chicago was founded as a canal town. That is, as the northern terminus of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which was to be the final link in a great national internal waterway that would connect New York with New Orleans via the Erie Canal, New York up to the Great Lakes via the Erie Canal, across the Great Lakes to Chicago, through the Illinois and Michigan Canal to the Des Plaines River, then the Illinois River, Mississippi, on down to New Orleans. We see that in this map, the original name of the canal was not the Illinois and Michigan Canal, but it was the Michigan and Illinois Canal. Now, this is an important moment in the state of Illinois' history. Why? Because it moved the northern boundary of the state of Illinois up 62 miles. You can see here on the left map, the original boundary of the state of Illinois would have been straight across from the tip of Lake Michigan following Indiana's state line. This would have put Chicago in Wisconsin. Well, the lawmakers at the time for the state of Illinois got them to move the territory of Illinois, got them to move the boundary up, as you see in the right-hand map, 62 miles, so that Chicago fell in the state of Illinois. Now, in 1829, the Illinois General Assembly appointed a commission to dig the canal and to lay out towns, sell lots, and apply the proceeds to the construction of the canal. In 1830, and this may be the original map that they were talking to. This is the original map of Chicago. In 1830, James Thompson laid out the town of Chicago as seen in the plat map here. This map set the location, pattern, and in many cases, the names of the streets and subdivisions of the future metropolis. As such, Thompson's plat may justifiably be considered the fundamental map of Chicago as an urban place. So we've got the canal. We've platted out a town at the northern terminus. We start building the canal. This fueled one of the most frenzied periods of land speculation in American history. They started to auction off the lots in Chicago, fueled by improved the harbor and started construction. Eastern investors soon began to flood Chicago with capital, and property values soared. An 80 by 100 lot at the corner of Clark and South Water Street. Here we go, right here. Oops. No, doesn't like me to touch it. Well, an 80 by 100 foot lot at the corner of Clark and South Water Street sold for $100 in 1832, $3,400 in 1834, and in 1835 it went for $15,000. You can see why Eastern investors were keen on sending capital to invest in Chicago, the new city. Now, the Thompson plat had been used for the land auction of 1830, which we just saw, but as parcels of land were subdivided and added to the town, new maps of the entire community were needed. And these usually took the form of manuscript plats and plans that were sent to Eastern investors to guide their investments. The first printed map of Chicago was published in 1834 by Joshua Hathaway Jr., and it's seen here. He used the original surveys of the town and the 3 new additions to produce this map. A similar but smaller map, there we go, was real estate map was also published in 1834, drawn by James Stephen Wright. It is dated with the year of its publication and shows many more blocks divided into lots than does Hathaway's. This is the reason that this is considered to be a later map than Hathaway's. Now, if you go to the Chicago History Museum, you'll see this map labeled as the first printed map of Chicago. I've tried to convince them that they're wrong, but they haven't changed it. So next time you go to the History Museum, you go up and say, you know, Hathaway's map isn't as subdivided as this one. Isn't that the earlier map? Maybe we can get them to change it. Okay. By 1850, Chicago's population was nearing 30,000. So it went from 350 people in 1833 to 30,000 17 years later. And the completion of the Illinois and Michigan Canal and the coming of the railroads were about to create a new real estate boom. As a result, despite the fact that the built-up portion of the city extended only a third of the way to its city limits, it would no longer be feasible to include all lots on a single map. Rather, the city would begin to be documented by atlases of real estate and fire insurance maps on a lot-by-lot basis. The map shown here is one of a kind. It was the last map that covered the entire city. But in fact, it is one of a kind. It's a hybrid between a real estate map and a street map. Considered the finest of the early maps of Chicago, its huge size, it is about 7 feet by 4 feet, permitted a detailed representation of the whole city, showing every lot to scale, as did earlier real estate maps, and the ownership of larger tracts. It also depicted every street in the city and included hundreds of features like buildings, factories, railroads, and parks. The voting wards of the city are shown in different colors, and the map includes a beautiful vignette of the city courthouse, which of course would burn down 20 years later. In 1846, there was not a single mile of railroad track in Chicago. By 1857, over 3,000 miles of railroad track led to Chicago, making it the center of the largest railway network in the world. The map shown here portrays the network of railroads leading to Chicago in 1855. Chicago's location along the longest inland water route in the world practically ensured that it would become a major rail center. The Great Lakes and the Erie Canal linked Chicago to New York, and the Illinois and Michigan Canal connected to Chicago to the Mississippi River and the Gulf of Mexico. By bringing rail lines to Chicago, the city would become a terminus of two great modes of transit, a prospect that Eastern investors were eager to promote. Chicago's geography was also instrumental in its emergence as the nation's largest rail hub. Railroads were destined to cross the continent, and in doing so, they played a fundamental role in creating a strong and unified nation. The railroads opened up the West and linked its development and destiny with the East. Lake Michigan, however, stood directly in the path of the shortest rail route from the far west to the far west and the northwest. Thus, railroads bound for these areas were forced to go around the lake's southern tip and directly through Chicago. In 1857, over 100 trains entered and left the city every day. Think that, 100 trains every day. And with them, of course, the products of farms and forests, and of course, people. The railroads had transformed Chicago into the nation's largest transportation and commercial center almost overnight. This transformation greatly altered the city's landscape, for wherever tracks were laid and they were run wherever the railroads desired, land use was immediately affected. Depots and train yards dominated their surrounding neighborhoods, and commercial and industrial development quickly gravitated toward the rail lines. Chicago literally grew up around its railroad tracks. It had to, as the railroads left only a 1 square mile in the center of the city free of their direct presence. No railroad had a bigger impact on Chicago's physical environment than the Illinois Central Railroad, whose directors had requested access to Chicago's inner harbor on a line directly along the lakefront. This was contrary to an edict by the Illinois and Michigan Canal Commission, which had set aside one parcel of land along the lakefront for public use, and on the Thompson plat, which was, we saw the original plat, had been marked the lakefront with these words: public ground, a common to remain forever open, clear, free of any buildings or other obstruction whatsoever. So in the original Canal Commissioner's plat, they marked the lakefront of Chicago to be ever open to the public. This is one of the reasons that was put forward for not having the Lucas Museum built a couple of years ago on the lakefront, because it would violate that precept. This provision distinguished Chicago from almost every other waterfront in America, where the choice land along the water's edge was typically appropriated by manufacturing and transportation concerns. These industries would soon develop into a wall of unsightly buildings and grounds, foul the water with their waste and runoff, and cut a city off from what was once its most picturesque feature. By 1850, this was, if you look up the river on this map, this was the fate of Chicago's riverfront. However, its lakefront, thus far, had remained free from development. So we've got the IC coming in. They want to put a railroad right along the lakefront into their terminus at the mouth of the Chicago River. After months of bitter haggling, the city and the railroad reached a compromise. The city would permit the railroad's trains to enter by way of a strip of land, not on the lakeshore, but several 100 feet out into the lake. So got around the provision in Thompson's plat map by having it in the lake, not on the lakefront. Okay. The reason that this was attractive to the city fathers at the time was because the lake would continually flood Promenade Park, and it would go right up to the princely mansions along Michigan Avenue, where a number of our city fathers lived at the time. So they wanted to get rid of this. If the IC has to build a railroad tracks out in the lake, what do they need to do? They need to protect those tracks. And how are they going to protect it? By building a breakwater. And that breakwater is still there today, although the IC tracks are much further inland now. So this striking view, by the way, I should point out this map, the Palminteri map, it's a very famous map. There are only a few copies known to exist. One sold a number of years ago for $240,000. Another one, suddenly when something like that happens, all of a sudden another one resurfaces. They did not get $240,000 for the last copy that was sold. I think they got 60,000, so they were still doing all right. So this striking view of 1857 view of the city shown here depicts the railroad tracks. Don't press too hard. So we're coming through the lake, you'll notice there, leading to the Illinois Central's terminal and branching out to warehouses at the mouth of the river. Individual buildings are clearly depicted along the city's grid, and the river is lined with warehouses for the storage of grain and lumber. Note that the basin between the lake shore and the railroad tracks right here. The city had tried to get the railroad to fill that in so that they could put a new park there, and the railroad balked at that idea. So Chicago residents used it for swimming, bathing, sailing, so it was a recreation area. However, when the IC decided to extend its terminal right here, they effectively closed off that basin, and it turned into a still pool filled with industrial debris, floating packing crates, and the bloated corpses of horses and cattle. No longer an attractive place to go swimming or sailing. In October of 1871, Chicago suffered one of the worst urban disasters in history, as a large portion of the city was destroyed by fire. At the time, Chicago was the fastest growing city in the world. In just under 4 decades, it had grown from a town of 3/8 of a square mile to a city of 18 square miles, and its population had grown from barely 350 to 340,000. So in 40 years, 350 to 340,000. The likelihood of the Great Fire was not unforeseen. In 1868, the fire department warned the mayor and the city council of the grave defects in which our city is being built. Indeed, almost every building outside of the central business district was constructed of wood, and even the marble buildings downtown had wooden cornices, long wooden signs on their fronts, and mansard top stories made of wood. Almost every roof in the city was made of wood and covered with felt, tar, or shingles. The city had miles of raised wooden sidewalks, and even the streets of the business district were lined with blocks of pine. So there was a lot of wood to burn in the city of Chicago in 1871. The fire department also warned that a great number of the city's strikingly beautiful new stores, hotels, and multi-story buildings were poorly constructed by swindling contractors. The Great Fire killed over 300 people, left more than 90,000 people homeless, and destroyed 4 square miles of the city, nearly 1/3 of the city's area. The map shown here is larger and more colorful than many similar maps that appeared at the time. What was the purpose of this map? Well, it was to document the fire area, but it had a bigger purpose. And it was to promote not the Great Fire, but the Great Rebuilding. The rebuilding of Chicago began almost immediately, and no city has recovered from a large-scale disaster as quickly as Chicago did. The first phase of rebuilding ended with the Depression of 1873 and resulted in a downtown that looked much the same as it did in 1871, except that it was larger and a few stories taller. By 1880, however, a new wave of construction had begun, and in a little over a decade, the entire downtown was completely rebuilt again. Anybody, besides more Eastern Capital, anybody guess what the impetus was for rebuilding the downtown in the late? Steve? Steel, and what you could use steel to do what? Build skyscrapers, exactly. So the next map now shows a much different town. This map shows the Central Business District from 1960. But by this time, Chicago had been converted into the first vertical city in the world. Skyscrapers replaced the buildings that had been built just a decade before. So 1871, we have the fire. The city gets rebuilt pretty much exactly the way it was before the fire. Within a decade, they start rebuilding the entire downtown with skyscrapers. And the result is what you see on this beautiful map of the Central Business District. So no large city has ever grown as fast as Chicago. In 1816, the site contained a military fort and a few dwellings inhabited by traders and trappers. By the time of the Great Fire, what was once a muddy swamp had become the rail, grain, lumber, and livestock capital of the world. By the time of the map shown here, Chicago was inhabited by well over 2 million people. So think of that. In less than 100 years, Chicago had a population of 2 million people. Chicago was the transportation center of an entire continent, was the home for many of this nation's major business enterprises, and was the second largest city in America. So I think I may have sped things up a little bit, but I think we'll stop there and I'll take some questions or comments. I should remind everybody, I'm a philosopher, not a historian, but I do know a fair amount about the history of Chicago. Yeah.
Why did they originally cite the city of the Forks instead of the Bound?
And Robert, anyway, if you could just repeat the question so that people at home and Zoom can hear the audience, that'd be great. Thank you.
So the question is, why did they, the original town get centered at the Forks rather than the mouth of the river? And you'll note, we can get back there quickly. Fort Dearborn is centered at the mouth of the river, and it was federal land. So there we go. So you see Fort Dearborn right here, right? And I should point out one thing here. So 1803 is when the federal troops first came to Chicago. And they built Fort Dearborn twice. In 1812, it was burned down in an Indian raid. And there was a massacre that is depicted on this map. Depicted on this map further out to the south. There we go. You'll see this, the stagecoach there on the left. There was a massacre that's been depicted by Juliet Kinsey, who is the first woman to publish a map of Chicago. Now, The second Fort Dearborn was rebuilt in 1812. And you'll see the peninsula below below the fort. And you'll notice that little channel that's cut into the sandbar there. The peninsula was basically just a big sandbar. So the fort was restocked by supply ships that would come in and anchor off in the lake, and the soldiers would row a boat out to the ship, transfer supplies, and row back. Well, before they cut in that little shortcut, they had to row all the way from the fort down to the mouth of the river, out to the ships, and all the way back. And they got the bright idea, let's cut this labor in half by putting a little shortcut through this sandbar. It didn't take much, it was all sand. So they cut this shortcut through and then the ships could dock right out there, and their labor was half. I should also note I said this peninsula is basically a sandbar. This was a detriment to the early development of Chicago because it didn't have a good harbor. And a lot of work went into, and a lot of maps were prepared of the harbor, and the attempts to stop the sand from filling in the harbor.
We have a question from somebody on Zoom, and he wants to know, can you show the IC rail line in the 1916 map?
Put on my glasses. So, and actually by this time, the IC might have been, it was right there.
I see. Okay.
Okay. But if you recall, and if you go downtown, where are the railroad tracks? They're down below, right? So as you actually look down to see the railroad tracks, the IC tracks, and then they come into the station at Randolph in Michigan. All right, so that's Michigan Avenue right there. Well, where did all of this extra landfill come from? In 1912, I believe, they built the Illinois Telegraph and Telephone Company built tunnels under downtown. And the idea was that they were going to use those tunnels for coal transport to various buildings, as well as supplies, merchandise, so on and so forth. Well, the advent of modern trucks shortly thereafter kind of made those tunnels obsolete. And so instead of using the railroad that they had built that went through those tunnels, they used those tunnels for telephone, telegraph, and eventually now video wires. Well, when they dug these tunnels, what did they do with all of the material that they took out of the tunnels? Well, you see it right here. All of the museum campus is built on landfill created from those tunnels, as well as some of Grant Park that was pushed out into the lake. Now, we all know what happened in 1994, right? A company that was pounding a pylon into the river pierced one of those tunnels and flooded the downtown. So when I published my book, I told this account, and my publisher came back to me and said, you've got too many words, you need to cut some of this stuff out. And I got a little angry with them, and I said, you edit it. And they edited out this whole flood section. I said, no, I got to take this back over because that's the most important thing about these underground tunnels, is the fact that they flooded in 1994. So yeah, so the comment was that when a member of our audience grew up in Chicago, in the 50s, the buildings downtown seemed really old. That's not so much the case anymore. And of course, and the buildings have also gotten what? Taller, right? So real estate has really pushed Chicago, and particularly downtown.
Robert, I was just wondering if I know how kind of maps kind of tell a story about the city, and I was just wondering if you have a favorite map, like one that you think tells a great story. Yeah, do you have a favorite map?
Yes, we showed it. The Palmetary map. That's the favorite map. So when this went up for auction through Hinman Auctions, and I started to bid on it. And I quickly realized, okay, I better stand down. And I thought about bidding on the second one that came up for auction after the one that sold for $240,000. And I said, no, I'm not even going to go there.
Are these owned by individuals or are they
Yes.
museums?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So two individuals bought this map. Now, the Newberry Library has a copy of this, as does the Historical Museum. But I think you'll notice this map. This is a typical view of Chicago. It's a bird's eye view. North is not at the top of this map, right? We're looking at Chicago from over the lake to the west. This is the typical depiction of Chicago in maps.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank you so much for
Thank
kind
you.
of teaching us so many things. I love the fact about the fact that the border of Illinois changed and Chicago would have been in Wisconsin. That was one of my most.
So the Vernon Area Public Library would be in Wisconsin as well.
Yes. Oh my goodness.
We couldn't have that.
That is the fascinating
Yeah,
fact that I'm going to
yeah.
share. So I just want to thank you so much for joining us today and coming out here. And thank you to everyone for joining us here at the library and online, and enjoy this beautiful day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.